Well, hello. It's Fred Weems. Today is the Monday after Thanksgiving, 2022. Let's see the exact date. It's the 28th of November. Time is, 9:30 or so p.m. I was at the public library using their computer to take my story, Right Jolly, which I wrote yesterday, and annotate it. And I got about two-thirds of the way through, and I was looking at my iPhone to verify a quotation. The computer warned me you have 30 minutes, so I clicked on it to say okay. And as I'm looking at the iPhone to get the information, all of a sudden the computer completely shut down. It didn't merely sign me out, it just closed, and I lost the document. Now, my computer home is always sluggish. It takes forever to make it start and forever to make changes, and it's a pain in the ass. So, I thought when I got home that I might copy and paste the story as typed on Facebook from yesterday and do the annotations, but that's a pain in the neck, and I can't do bold facing. I can't, At the library, I had this Word doc that was going. I had bold-faced and italic and all of that stuff in my phrasing. Anyway, what I'm going to do now, simply so I have it in here, in my head, and then I can maybe look back at this if I want to remember. Because it's sort of fresh in my mind, I'm going to put the annotations in as I read this out loud. Now, how am I going to make it clear which parts are the annotated parts? I don't know. I'll try to make it obvious. The annotated Right Jolly, in which I explain references, justify jokes, and change one line. The old elf's cheeks were crimson as the crushed velvet jacket and pants he'd pulled out of the wardrobe. In Clement Clarke Moore's 1823 poem, The Night Before Christmas, actually called A Visit from St. Nicholas, Santa is referred to as a right jolly old elf. Sitting on the deerskin coverlet, because Santa is not averse to skinning his transportation. He practically fell off the bed, bending over to put his boots on. His ears filling with his own gasps, he heard Mrs. Claus say, "Would you like a Coke?" "No," he said to his assistant, who wasn't any more his wife than Jack White's wife was his sister. Jack and Meg White of the White Stripes are a married couple, but they used to pretend in interviews that they were brother and sister. A lot of people were fooled. And puffed on the pipe clenched in his teeth. Clement Clarke Moore has the line, "The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth." "Those bastards haven't paid me since I posed for Mexican Coke. Get me some Pepsi." The Santa we know, post Clement Clarke Moore, is really the mid-20th century Santa of the magazine ads and billboards, usually in oil painting. He's sort of a chubby Rotarian. And the major cola companies both used Santa. One of the Santas was actually the Quaker Oats guy. In any case, Mrs. Claus says to him, "We have 7-Up." Fuck. I'll just smoke my pipe. God damn the supply chain." Santa's a Republican. Mrs. Claus went away anyway. "Don't mix it with RC," Santa called, immediately coughing. Royal Crown Cola, always the bridesmaid to Coke and Pepsi. He buckled his right boot and then the left. He sat up, feeling the blood rush from his head, and putting a hand on the bedpost where his pointed red cap was, attempted standing. Mrs. Claus came back in, a glass of yellowish liquid in her hand. The author, me, always thinks implying pee is funny. She was dressed all in red. "Do we have to do this year?" said Santa. Mrs. Claus only said, "Not my call, boss." She handed him the glass. "Come on," Santa said, gulping down the drink. "Mountain Dew," he muttered. Mountain Dew is the dead man's 7-Up. He looked at Mrs. Claus, and she looked at him with a look as weary as his. Santa put his cap on. "I'll tell them." They went into the hall, both pushing open the frosty double doors. "Ho, ho, ho," Santa shouted. "Ha, ha," laughed Mrs. Claus. They looked at the citizens of Santa Town. Now, really, this story of mine is a rip-off of Rudolph. The town in Rudolph is really called Christmas Town, but I forgot that when I was writing this yesterday. "Friends," bellowed Santa, not that he'd known any in his entire existence, "I must announce that Christmas will be canceled this year. All specials, post-Rudolph, and including Rudolph, toy with the idea of Santa canceling Christmas. He didn't do that shit before Rudolph." The elves stood in the snow. The reindeer stared. "Moan," said Mrs. Claus. "Clap," said Jeb Bush. The light in Rudolph's nose went out, making a damp zapping sound. "We're being recorded," Santa said. "He's making a list. He's checking it twice," an elf, or even a reindeer, half sang. That is a line, of course, from the song Santa Claus Has Come to Town, a big hit in 1934 for Eddie Cantor, the first of what my father used to call the Mafia Christmas songs. And Rankin Bass made use of that. There was a special they made about 5 years after Rudolph with Fred Astaire, or the voice of Fred Astaire, called Santa Claus Is Coming to Town. Now, that song has a sentiment Rankin Bass loves. The censorious Santa, the Santa who's looking to punish. He's making a list. He's checking it twice. Going to find out who's naughty and nice. By the way, it is naughty and nice, not naughty or nice. In any case, that's the punishing Santa, the Santa who might cancel Christmas, the Santa who Donner is so afraid of that he covers Rudolph's electrified nose, saying, he covers it with clay, and he says, "Santa won't object to you now." Conversion therapy, anyone? "Norelco," breathed Santa. "Contract?" Norelco used to sponsor Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. They would ride down the snow on little snowmobiles made of Norelco razors. Hermie came forward. "Yes, Herbie," Mrs. Claus said officiously. Any Rudolph forum eventually gets to the controversy, do they say Herbie and Hermie? The battery went. Do they say Herbie and Hermie in the special? Many people think they do. They think that the actors forgot that his name was Hermie, and one of them said Herbie instead, and that it stayed. And, of course, we can't tell from reading the lips because they're animagic, and they don't have lips. Now, let's see. I'm plugging this in and checking it twice. I'm going to hold this here because I'm plugging it in, and it won't stand. "We've been thinking," said the wannabe dentist. "Doing this it's canceled thing each year is like pulling teeth." Rudolph, unscrewing his nose and tossing it into a snowbank, said, "It's never really canceled." A gruff voice from the little factory began to be heard. An elf with a goatee ran forward. "You left the door open," Hermie said to him as he approached. "No need to keep the factory warm," said the goateed elf, looking threateningly at everyone, including the Clauses. "We're not pretending to care this year if Christmas is canceled." You could have heard a snowflake fall. From over the pines, the elves, the reindeer, Mrs. Claus, and Santa himself heard a haunted voice singing Ghost Riders in the Sky. Mrs. Claus fell to her knees. "He's singing his hit. He's finally happy. I forgive him for labeling me a communist." In my original story, written just yesterday, the line was, Mrs. Claus fell to her knees. He's singing his hit. He's finally happy. But I decided to go meta. And I added, I forgive him for labeling me a communist. Now the thing is this. Burl Ives played Sam the Snowman. Burl Ives was a really, really good and influential folk singer. He had a great success with Ghost Riders in the Sky, although Vaughn Monroe had the massive hit. And certainly, Burl Ives would probably much rather have sung Ghost Riders in the Sky or Rightful Titty-Fied Day or whatever instead of Silver and Gold and all these really commercial songs. But he is famous for having named Pete Seeger before the House Un-American Activities Committee as a communist. Pete Seeger, later in his life, was interviewed, and the interviewer said, I saw you hugging Burl Ives just recently at a show. And Pete Seeger said, oh, yes. And the interviewer goes, well, why? He called you a communist. And Pete Seeger said, well, you know, we live our lives. We go on. He's a friend of mine. We love each other. We hugged. Pete Seeger, who always kind of defended Stalin until toward the end of his life he finally said, well, you know, Mr. Stalin did some unacceptable things, was nevertheless an old Yankee liberal. He was a nice guy, and he did not hold a personal grudge against Burl Ives. Anyway, the head elf said to Santa Claus, there's no need to announce that Christmas is canceled this year. We don't object. The elves bowed their heads. Hermes said, we didn't think you were with us. The head elf said, I was pissed off all those other years because I knew we'd always actually have Christmas. That elf is a very gruff little elf. He's always mean. He's mean to Herbie. He mocks him for wanting to be a dentist instead of making toys. But my reading of psychology, because I've known people like this. They're angry all the time, and what it is they think they're being pushed to the wall. And they're just going to get screwed. And so that boss is like that, so he's a hard ass. He thinks he's going to get screwed, but when it's the chance to actually finally cancel Christmas and get rid of this horrible thing that hangs over them every year, they can relax, and he's happy. The reindeer, the elves, and Mrs. Claus looked at Santa. Don't look at me, said Santa Claus. They ran to get the Bumble, finding him in a crevice where an avalanche had been. They got him to crawl out after promising to let him eat the toy shop where they'd toiled many seasons. Hermie offered to nail his teeth back in first because he'd kept them, but the abominable snowman simply swallowed the workshop whole. The reindeer shouted out with glee. That's a line from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer by Johnny Marks, as they shouted out with glee. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, you'll go down in history. Yukon Cornelius, transcontinental that he was, telegraphed Coke, Pepsi, and Norelco to tell them the cancellation ritual was itself canceled because Christmas wasn't going to be a thing this year or next year. Yukon Cornelius is the person who names the abominable snowman La Bumble, and he does travel all over the place, so he's transcontinental. And, yes, he approves of Hermie being a dentist. He's sort of the Bernie Sanders of the whole scene. The next morning, they could hear the voices of Whoville singing Dahudores. Now, I looked up what I thought was Damudores from How the Grinch Stole Christmas. They all sing at the end when they don't actually get their presents because they believe in a higher power and love, and they believe they get the whole message. But Santa having actually canceled Christmas, and the Hooves are clearly not getting the presents, they're singing happily. Santa can't quite take that. Jesus, said Santa, turning to Mrs. Claus, we may have to revive Christmas next year. Anything to keep them from singing that, said Mrs. Claus. You see, they want to bring Christmas back so that the Damodores, Whoville types will get their presents, and so maybe they won't sing. They'll sing anyway, but they'll sing even without presents. But Santa thinks having to hear them is a pain in the ass, so he's going to revive Christmas. Anyway, I looked up Damudores, and it turns out to be Dahudores. So all the years, Dahudores, but they make variations on that word. Anyway, the who I hate the most is the one he's sort of got a beard with no mustache. Always disturbing. Anyway, now you have the final line. And now she was Mrs. Claus. They'd married at midnight, the exact moment Christmas was canceled, for real. Anyway, I annotated it, and then just as I was finishing up, the goddamn computer crashed at the library. And so I had to read it this way, and I'm sure it's a weird experience. If you've endured this, thank you.